The Rocktool were seasoned diplomats. As a highly advanced galactic civilization, they'd encountered countless strange worlds and unusual traditions. Yet, Earth was a unique case. From afar, humanity seemed disorganized, chaotic, and utterly unpredictable. They lacked a central governing body like the Galactic Council, yet they had accomplished something rare: complete planetary dominance. Admiral VX of the Rocktool Intergalactic Coalition harbored doubts about this mission. What could these seemingly primitive beings possibly offer? Nevertheless, orders were orders. Their objective was to study humanity, decipher their unique qualities, and assess Earth's potential as either ally or threat. The Rocktool flagship, the HFY, slipped into Earth's orbit undetected, its sleek, dark hull blending seamlessly with the planet's natural satellites. VX stood on the bridge, gazing at the pale blue and green orb below. "Curious little world," he murmured, his voice echoing in the metallic chamber. Beside him, Ambassador Zor prepared to lead the diplomatic team to the surface. "Do you believe they comprehend the significance of this meeting?" VX inquired. "Humans are volatile," Zor replied, his antennae twitching nervously. "However, my analysis of their communications indicates a strong desire to make a positive impression." The intercepted transmissions revealed a flurry of messages, warnings, and formal invitations. Earth's diverse governments were attempting to present a unified front for their extraterrestrial guests. The Rocktool, with their advanced technology, saw through this facade almost immediately. However, the genuine excitement of humanity to encounter alien life intrigued Zor. "Let's get this over with," VX grumbled, gesturing toward the Earth below. The Rocktool shuttle descended smoothly through the atmosphere, landing gracefully on a pristine tarmac somewhere in the northern hemisphere. The chosen meeting location was a large, glass-walled structure, surrounded by representatives from various human governments. Cameras flashed, documenting the historic event as the Rocktool delegation disembarked. The humans greeted them with warm smiles, handshakes, and nods, eager to demonstrate their hospitality. Pleasantries were exchanged, introductions made in both native languages and through sophisticated translation devices. Then, as a gesture of goodwill, the human delegation offered the aliens a customary social beverage, coffee. To humans, it was a simple, almost mundane offering, a routine part of daily life. To the Rocktool, it was an entirely foreign substance. Zor eyed the steaming, dark liquid with a hint of suspicion as it was poured into delicate ceramic cups. "Is this sustenance?" he inquired, his translated voice carrying a blend of curiosity and caution. A middle-aged human representative, distinguished by graying hair and an enthusiastic smile, nodded. "It's a drink we enjoy. Quite invigorating, actually. We call it coffee." VX, ever the pragmatist, narrowed his eyes. "Are there any adverse effects?" "Side effects," the man chuckled. "Oh, nothing significant. It just helps you wake up, focus a bit more sharply. Some of us rely on it to function throughout the day." Zor glanced at VX, who shrugged. "It's a gesture of goodwill," VX muttered. "We can't risk causing offense." The Rocktool cautiously accepted the cups, mirroring the humans by raising the beverages to their lips and taking tentative sips. And that's when things took an unexpected turn. The room fell silent as the Rocktool sampled the coffee. The humans watched expectantly, anticipating a compliment, a nod of approval, perhaps even a request for another cup. What they received instead was bewilderment. Zor was the first to speak. "This is not unpleasant," he remarked, his speech slightly slower than usual. His typically steady hands trembled subtly as he set the cup down. VX followed suit, nodding in agreement. "Strange," he murmured, "but tolerable." Yet, his eyelids had begun to twitch. The human delegation, pleased with themselves, resumed their pleasantries, explaining the history of coffee, its significance in human culture, and how some people couldn't imagine starting their day without it. The Rocktool, however, were no longer listening. Something was happening. Zor blinked rapidly, his vision blurring. "Ambassador," he said, turning to VX, "is the temperature rising in here?" His pale, bluish-gray skin had taken on a faint purple hue. VX grunted in response, but he too seemed distracted, his gaze darting around the room as if he couldn't focus. The humans continued their conversation, oblivious to the escalating situation. Zor, now perspiring profusely, abruptly stood, his eyes wide. I feel unusually sensitive to everything, he exclaimed, startling the human delegation. His antennae stood rigid, twitching uncontrollably as he scanned the room. He gripped the edge of the table, his fingers clenching with unexpected force. "Admiral," he announced, his voice rising, "I believe there is something significantly wrong with this beverage. My heart rate is accelerating. I can feel every single beat." VX, now perspiring heavily, abruptly rose, his eyes wide with alarm. I feel unusually sensitive to everything, he exclaimed, his voice rising in pitch, startling the human delegation. His antennae stood rigid, twitching erratically as he scanned the room. Gripping the edge of the table for support, his fingers clenched with unexpected force. "Admiral," he announced, his voice strained, "I believe there is something significantly wrong with this beverage. My heart rate is accelerating. I can perceive every single beat." Meanwhile, VX was experiencing his own internal crisis. His typically stoic face contorted into an expression of utter bewilderment. His hands twitched involuntarily as he struggled to remain seated, glaring at the now empty cup before him. "What manner of sorcery is this?" he muttered under his breath. A human diplomat, noticing the escalating tension, raised a hand to try and calm the situation. Everything all right over there? You seem a little off." Zor whirled around to face the man, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Off? Off? I can hear colors. I can see sounds. Everything is excessively loud." The humans exchanged confused glances. "It's just coffee," one of them offered, laughing nervously. "Maybe it's a little strong for your first time." VX, however, was now also standing, his body visibly trembling. His normally deep, gravelly voice had risen several octaves. "This is unacceptable. You stated it was energizing, not mind-altering." The human delegation, still oblivious to the true gravity of the situation, attempted to ease the tension with reassurances and awkward chuckles. "Maybe just take a few deep breaths?" But the rock tool could no longer hear them. Zor was now pacing frantically, muttering incoherently to himself about quantum mechanics and gravitational anomalies. "Time is an illusion," he declared, throwing his arms in the air. "And we're all just floating in a cosmic soup." VX, abandoning all pretense of composure, clenched his fists, his face reddening. "What sort of war fuel is this?" he roared. One of the human scientists, Dr. Emily Hargrove, who had been silently observing the entire debacle, leaned over to her colleague and whispered, "Did anyone consider checking if caffeine has any adverse effects on their biology?" Her colleague, Professor Marcus Rhodes, blinked in sudden realization. "Oh, no. No one checked that." The scene in the room had devolved into utter chaos. Zor had begun dismantling one of the chairs with incredible speed, his hands moving faster than the human eye could follow. "I must construct something. Something that will solve everything," he shrieked. VX, on the other hand, had abandoned any remaining semblance of composure and was now furiously tapping on his personal data tablet. "The numbers! The numbers don't make sense anymore," he bellowed. The humans, finally realizing that something had gone terribly wrong, huddled together, watching in stunned silence as their alien guests unraveled before their eyes. "This is, wow," Hargrove muttered, watching Zor as he attempted to reverse engineer the coffee machine. "I've never seen anything like this." Rhodes sighed, rubbing his temples. "Well, at least we know one thing for sure." "What's that?" Hargrove asked. He gestured toward the rock tool, now deep in the throes of caffeine-induced mania. "Aliens really can't handle coffee." Zor, now perspiring heavily, abruptly rose, his eyes wide with alarm. I feel unusually sensitive to everything," he exclaimed, startling the human delegation. His antennae stood rigid, twitching erratically as he scanned the room. He gripped the edge of the table for support, his fingers clenching with unexpected force. "Admiral," he announced, his voice strained, "I believe there is something significantly wrong with this beverage. My heart rate is accelerating. I can perceive every single beat." VX, meanwhile, was undergoing his own internal struggle. His normally stoic expression was replaced by one of utter bewilderment. His hands twitched involuntarily as he fought to remain seated, his gaze fixed on the empty cup before him. "What manner of sorcery is this?" he muttered under his breath. A human diplomat, noticing the growing unease, raised a hand in an attempt to pacify the situation. "Is everything all right? You gentlemen seem a bit unsettled." Zor spun around, eyes wide and unblinking. "Unsettled? Unsettled? I can hear colors. I can see sounds. The volume of everything is overwhelming." The humans exchanged puzzled glances. "It's just coffee," one of them offered with a nervous laugh. "Perhaps it's a little strong for your first experience." VX, however, was now also standing, his body trembling noticeably. His typically deep voice had risen several octaves. "This is unacceptable. You assured us it was energizing, not hallucinogenic." The human delegation, still failing to grasp the seriousness of the situation, tried to diffuse the tension with reassurances and awkward chuckles. "Maybe just try taking some deep breaths?" But the Rocktool were beyond hearing them. Zor was now pacing frantically, muttering incoherently about quantum physics and gravitational distortions. "Time is a fabrication," he declared, his arms flailing wildly. "And we are merely drifting in a cosmic broth." VX, abandoning all pretense of composure, clenched his fists, his face flushed. "What kind of battlefield stimulant is this?" he roared. Dr. Emily Hargrove, a human scientist who had been quietly observing the entire episode, leaned over to her colleague and whispered, "Did anyone think to investigate the potential effects of caffeine on their physiology?" Her colleague, Professor Marcus Rhodes, blinked in sudden comprehension. "Oh, dear. No, no one considered that." The room had descended into complete pandemonium. Zor had begun disassembling one of the chairs with astonishing speed, his hands moving too quickly for the human eye to track. "I must construct something that will resolve everything," he shrieked. VX, meanwhile, had lost all semblance of control and was furiously tapping on his personal data pad. "The calculations! The figures are no longer coherent," he bellowed. The humans, finally realizing the severity of the situation, huddled together, watching in stunned silence as their alien guest succumbed to the effects of the coffee. "This is extraordinary," Hargrove murmured, watching Zor's attempts to reverse engineer the coffee machine. "I've never witnessed anything like it." Rhodes sighed, rubbing his temples. "Well, at least we've learned one thing." "And what's that?" Hargrove inquired. He gestured towards the Rocktool, now deep in the throes of caffeine-induced mania. "Aliens cannot tolerate coffee." VX, meanwhile, was experiencing his own internal turmoil. His typically stoic face was a mask of bewilderment. His hands twitched involuntarily as he fought to remain in his seat, his gaze locked on the empty cup before him. "What manner of witchcraft is this?" he muttered softly. A human diplomat, sensing the growing discomfort, raised a hand to try and de-escalate the situation. "Is everything to your liking, gentlemen? You seem a bit uneasy." Zor spun around, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Uneasy? Uneasy? I perceive colors through auditory stimuli. I visualize sounds. The intensity of all sensory input is overwhelming." The humans exchanged bewildered glances. "It's simply coffee," one of them offered, a nervous laugh escaping their lips. "Perhaps a bit strong for a first-time experience." VX, however, was now standing as well, his body noticeably trembling. His deep, gravelly voice had risen considerably in pitch. "This is preposterous. You claimed it had invigorating properties, not psychotropic ones." The human delegation, still unaware of the true gravity of the situation, continued their attempts to alleviate the tension with empty reassurances and strained chuckles. "Perhaps a few deep breaths might be beneficial?" but the rock tool were beyond the reach of their words. Zor was now pacing frantically, muttering incoherently about the intricacies of quantum physics and the distortions of gravity. "Time is merely a construct," he declared, his arms flung wide. "And we are but insignificant entities adrift in a cosmic stew." VX, relinquishing all semblance of self-control, clenched his fists, his face flushed crimson. "What manner of battlefield concoction is this?" he roared. Dr. Emily Hargrove, a human scientist who had remained a silent observer throughout this unfolding drama, leaned towards her colleague and whispered, "Did it occur to anyone to investigate the potential physiological impact of caffeine on their species?" Her colleague, Professor Marcus Rhodes, blinked in sudden understanding. "Oh, dear. No, that oversight was not addressed." The room had descended into absolute chaos. Zor had commenced dismantling one of the chairs with astonishing speed, his hands moving with a blur of motion too rapid for the human eye to follow. "I must engage in construction. I must construct a device to resolve this predicament," he shrieked. VX, in contrast, had relinquished all attempts at composure and was now frantically tapping on his personal data pad. "The numerical data! The figures have lost all coherence," he bellowed. The humans, finally comprehending the magnitude of the situation, huddled together, observing in stunned silence as their alien guests succumbed to the unexpected effects of the coffee. "This is remarkable," Hargrove murmured, her eyes fixed on Zor's efforts to reverse engineer the coffee machine. "I have never witnessed such a phenomenon." Rhodes sighed, rubbing his temples wearily. "Well, one certainty has emerged from this experience." "And what might that be?" Hargrove inquired. He gestured towards the rock tool, now fully immersed in the throes of caffeine-induced mania. "Aliens, it seems, possess a distinct intolerance for coffee." Back on the HFY, chaos continued to unfold. Admiral VX had managed to return to the ship, though in a state best described as frantic. His composure, usually so unwavering, had been shattered by the overwhelming effects of the caffeine. As the ship's medics rushed to assess both him and Ambassador Zor, the findings were alarming. "Admiral, I must inform you." The medical officer paused, eyes darting nervously to the bioscanner in his hands. "The substance you ingested, this coffee, it's effectively a neurotoxin for the rock tool." VX, now lying on what served as an alien medical bed, still twitched slightly as his system struggled to process the caffeine. His eyes darted back and forth too rapidly to focus. "A neurotoxin?" His voice was a mere whisper, yet somehow still filled with disbelief. The medic nodded grimly. "Yes, Admiral. Harmless to humans, but in rock tool physiology, it disrupts neural pathways, accelerates synaptic firing. The result is your brain operating at an unsustainable speed. You've been, quite literally, overloaded." At the other end of the medical bay, Ambassador Zor was still conscious, but only barely. He mumbled incoherently, occasionally uttering phrases like quantum flux matrices within the temporal distortion field, before trailing off into nonsensical gibberish. His body, too, twitched uncontrollably. What could possess them to imbibe this concoction daily? VX sputtered between labored breaths. "Admiral, this is more serious than we initially assessed," the medic continued. "The human substance, caffeine, is processed in their livers in a manner that allows for mild stimulation. For us, however, it triggers a systemic reaction, flooding our bodies with adrenaline-like chemicals. The result is, well, precisely what you're experiencing." VX groaned. He had fought in interstellar wars, negotiated peace treaties with species capable of obliterating planets, commanded some of the most sophisticated warships in the galaxy, and yet, a simple cup of coffee had brought him to his knees. Meanwhile, back at the human base, the situation had not gone unnoticed. Dr. Hargrove and Professor Rhodes were in full damage control mode, trying to comprehend the events that had just transpired. The rock tool had been returned to their ship in a state of confusion and uncontrolled tremors, leaving behind a diplomatic disaster. "We need to find a way to reverse this," Rhodes muttered, pacing back and forth in the laboratory. "We just inadvertently poisoned the first alien diplomats to ever visit Earth. This is not ideal." Hargrove sat at her desk, reviewing the biological scans the aliens had provided. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a series of complex molecular diagrams. "Their neural architecture is fundamentally different from ours. Caffeine affects them like a sledgehammer. It's like pouring rocket fuel into a toy car. It simply doesn't function the same way." Rhodes glanced at the scans and winced. "And we gave them espresso. We didn't just give them coffee, we gave them the most potent version we had." Back on the HFY, the chaos continued its tumultuous reign. Admiral VX had managed to make his way back to the ship, but his state could best be described as highly agitated. The caffeine had utterly shattered his normally unshakable composure. As the ship's medical personnel rushed to evaluate both him and Ambassador Zor, their findings were quite disconcerting. "Admiral, I am obligated to inform you," the medical officer began, his eyes nervously flitting to the readings on the bioscanner in his grasp. "This coffee that you ingested, it appears to be, for Rocktool physiology, essentially a neurotoxin." VX, now reclining on the Rocktool equivalent of a medical bed, still exhibited slight tremors as his body struggled to process the lingering caffeine. His eyes darted around the room, unable to fixate on any one object. "A neurotoxin," he whispered, his voice a thread of disbelief. The medic nodded grimly. "Affirmative, Admiral. Harmless to humans, but within the Rocktool biological framework, it disrupts established neural pathways and drastically increases synaptic firing, effectively causing your brain to operate at an unsustainable velocity. To put it plainly, you have experienced a systemic overload." Across the medical bay, Ambassador Zor remained conscious, but only just. He muttered incoherently, occasionally stringing together phrases like quantum entanglement matrices within the space-time continuum, before descending back into incomprehensible babble. His body, too, continued to twitch involuntarily. What could possibly compel them to routinely imbibe this concoction? VX stammered between labored breaths. "Admiral, the situation is more critical than our initial assessment indicated," the medic continued. "Humans process this caffeine in their livers in a way that results in mild stimulation. However, for our species, it triggers a full-body reaction, flooding our systems with chemicals analogous to adrenaline. The outcome is, well, precisely what you are currently experiencing." VX groaned. He had participated in interstellar wars, negotiated treaties with species capable of planetary annihilation, and commanded some of the galaxy's most advanced warships, and yet, a simple cup of coffee had brought him to his knees. Meanwhile, back at the human base, the situation was far from over. Dr. Hargrove and Professor Rhodes were in full damage control mode, striving to comprehend the events that had just unfolded. The Rocktool had been returned to their ship in a state of utter disarray, leaving a diplomatic disaster in their wake. "We must devise a method to reverse this," Rhodes muttered, pacing anxiously around the laboratory. "We have inadvertently poisoned the first alien diplomats to ever grace our planet. This is less than optimal." Hargrove sat at her desk, meticulously reviewing the biological data the aliens had provided. "Observe this," she said, indicating a complex series of molecular diagrams. "Their neural architecture is fundamentally different from our own. Caffeine impacts them like the blunt force trauma. It is akin to fueling a child's toy car with rocket propellant. The results are unpredictable, to say the least." Rhodes glanced at the scans and winced. "And we served them espresso. Not just coffee, but the most concentrated form we possess." This incident had spiraled from a simple cultural exchange into a full-blown physiological crisis. The question now wasn't just about diplomacy, but about the very survival of the Rocktool delegation and the future of interspecies relations. The weight of this unexpected burden fell heavily upon both human and alien shoulders, a stark reminder of the profound differences that could exist between even the most well-intentioned civilizations. And all because of coffee.